When the Sega 32X launched in late 1994, it was meant to be a low-price entry into the world of 32-bit gaming. It promised the ability to provide 3D polygon games well beyond what we had seen on the Genesis before it, and make those 2D games look and sound even better. There were those within Sega that believed the new CD-ROM-based Saturn was just too expensive for the Western market, and a product like the 32X was an absolute necessity. The game plan was to scoop up all the die-hard early adopters with the Saturn while scoring the rest of the Genesis owners with this add-on. During the life of the 32X, it would share a number of the same games with the Genesis and Sega CD, giving us an opportunity to compare the three directly and see if the 32X used any of that extra 32-bit power to actually enhance those games. In part 1 of this 3-part series, we will be comparing 7 games that were pretty close in regards to design and content between the Genesis and 32X platforms. Did the 32X version smoke the vanilla Genesis? Let's take a look. Our first game is pretty interesting for 2 reasons. First, neither the Sega Genesis or 32X had any hardware sprite scaling capabilities. Second, both games appeared relatively soon after the launch of the 2 platforms. The extra horsepower under the hood of the 32X really makes a difference here, however. You get more color, faster, smoother software sprite scaling, and better music to top it off. In fact, the 32X version can be compared directly to the original arcade and still fares well. It was for a time the best home version of Afterburner 2 available on a Sega platform, easily killing the Genesis and Master System variants before it. The Sega Saturn version showed up a while later and stole the title, but even then the 32X edition was a fine version to play. To be honest, this is the kind of stuff I was hoping to see on the Sega CD in 1992. But by the time it showed up on the 32X years later, the luster of these visuals were lost on a lot of people. Still, the 32X did right by Afterburner, and this one is definitely worth your time. While the poor Genesis game pales in comparison, it was still a fun game in 1990. It sports much less detail, and let's be honest, those ground missions look terrible, but I think for the hardware you can't hate on it too much. Mortal Kombat II was incredibly popular back then. When it hit home on the Genesis and Super Nintendo, the latter commanded most of the respect in regards to being more accurate to the original arcade vision, particularly when it came to sound effects. When it was released for the 32X in 1995, it was still quite the popular fighter, and I was really excited to see how much better it could be. There's no doubt about it, it was a big upgrade across the board. Stages had more color, sprites were animated better, sound effects were clearer, and there were a lot more of them. My only real complaint was they didn't try and give us the arcade soundtrack, instead opting to use the Genesis tunes virtually untouched. But the best part was they didn't mess around with the lightning fast gameplay, making this version the one to own for quite a while. Were the upgrades worth another $70 at the time? If you were a big enough Mortal Kombat 2 fan, I'd say yes. It was amazing how much difference having the missing sound effects back made in this game. I mean, if cart size was an issue in the Genesis version, I would have rather have had a stage cut out to fit in the missing samples. Sound often gets minimized when compared to visuals, and I think this game alone proves what an error that can be.
Fight! Round 1, fight! Come here! Outstanding.
popular arcade game NBA Jam Tournament Edition made its way to both the Genesis and 32X. The 4-player Genesis version was always an outstanding port of the game, so the 32X really had something to build on. It came on a bigger cartridge and boasted improved visuals, such as player sprite scaling like the arcade original and improved sound effects. But compared 1-to-1, how big of a difference is actually here? You still get a ton of dithering across the court and crowd, most of the assets are the same across the scoreboard and front end, and I dare say the music itself isn't all that great. The voice samples are louder, clearer, and there are more of them, giving you that arcade feeling quite nicely. I must confess that the larger scaling sprites of the 32X version have an off-putting mix with the backgrounds. The Genesis sprites fit in better in terms of size and detail. I don't know, this one is a mixed bag for sure. While I appreciate the voice work, the visuals of the 32X release don't really do a lot to warrant a 32-bit label. While the scaling players are closer to the arcade's presentation, the funky looking sprites take a hit in the process. From a gameplay perspective though, either one will do. They both still play a hell of a game of 2-on-2 hoops.
From the outside, sweet touch. Head fake. Jams it in. Boom shakalaka.
NFL Quarterback Club suffers much the same way that NBA Jam does on the 32X, only in reverse. While the 32X version gives us a field that is rendered as a 3D plane, the sprites are nearly identical to the Genesis version in size, animation, and detail. The information bars, scoreboards, and front end are also extremely similar, if not outright identical in places. I do like the more 3D field in the 32X version, especially how it allows you to look downfield better, but these two games are far more similar than they are different. I didn't expect Acclaim to redo the player sprites into 3D polygons or anything, but you at least would think they would have done more to spice them up and increase the detail and size. As a matter of fact, all this really did was bring the game up to the Super Nintendo's level of presentation. Side by side, it certainly doesn't destroy the Genesis version visually, and perhaps most disappointing of all, the sound effects are pretty much identical, with only a bit more clarity in its overall quality. While I do think it's better than the Genesis release, this thing was $70 at launch, and it damn sure wasn't worth that. Curiously, this was released in every major region despite NFL football's limited appeal outside of North America.
That green put first down. That white 51 hut. First down.
Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure was an interesting release for the 32X. It saw some big color enhancements over the Genesis release, but suffers from some serious frame rate issues while playing. This is basically because, unlike the Genesis, the 32X itself had no specific hardware for scrolling 2D graphics efficiently. This had the unfortunate side effect of some 2D games running at 30 frames per second versus their usual 60 frames per second, with Pitfall here being one of them. So while you do get a better looking game, the trade-off is far from worth it. The slower update makes things much more difficult to play in my experience. Whereas I can make my way through the Genesis version's first 3 levels, I find myself having heaps of trouble making jumps and taking hits in the 32X. Activision even skimped out on trying to improve the audio on any level. The sound effects and music are identical to the Genesis version in every way that matters, and I couldn't pinpoint any decent improvements anywhere. This one always had some great animation, and that at least returns, but that performance leaves much to be desired. This was also released on the Sega CD, and that one gets the nod for best playing version on a Sega system. While nowhere near as popular as Street Fighter II or Mortal Kombat, Primal Rage had its fans back in the day. When the Genesis version was released, it took a major hit in both sound and visual fidelity when compared to the arcade original. The 32X version sought to remedy this by bumping up the color and improving the sound. Was it able to succeed? Well, it's definitely better than the Genesis version, of that I can confidently say. Right off the bat, you notice stages have more color and better details. The cool line scrolling makes a return too, so there's no question each stage manages to impress a bit more. The sprites are also more colorful and even a tad larger, bringing them a more arcade feel. Even the little humans scurrying around in the battles are better looking on the 32X. Time Warner Interactive even cleared up the sound effects here. This makes for an improved home port in every single way, but let's be realistic here. It's still a world away from being arcade accurate. It still has way less animation, much smaller fighters, and the overall detail and clarity is no match at all. The Saturn and PlayStation would receive ports around the same time that just murdered what you see from the old 32X here. So yeah, it was better than the Genesis, but still way behind other versions of the game. Our last game for part 1 is Tough Man Contest, the boxing game from Electronic Arts that played a little like Nintendo's Punch-Out arcade game. Here you must fight your way through an amateur boxing competition against fighters from all over the globe. The Genesis version of this game wasn't particularly great, so the 32X really didn't have a ton to work with. For what it's worth, the backgrounds were completely redesigned with loads more color and detail, and the sound effects have been improved across the board. It definitely looks better back there, but everything to do with the fighters is very similar. Animation looks the same, as do the menu screens. Despite the visual improvements, there are still areas of heavy dithering in the background and fighters, so it still looks like a 16-bit game. The Saturn and PlayStation wouldn't have been caught dead with these visuals. I will say this though, if you enjoyed the gameplay on the Genesis, it's more of the same, so the visual improvements may make it worth a look for some of you.
One, two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. One, two, 3, 4, 5, 6.
That wraps up part 1 of our look at the games that appeared on both the Genesis and the 32X. I think an early conclusion that most third parties just took their original 16-bit engines and improved them slightly for the 32X is definitely the case. In some of these games, the Genesis was still handling a great deal of the graphics and sound, meaning that no matter what, it was still gonna have elements that felt very much 16-bit. This perhaps was the entire problem with add-on systems in general. It just wasn't cost feasible to completely rebuild a game from scratch with new assets, so we were always gonna get slight improvements the vast majority of the time. Sadly, when a game was built from the ground up, you really did see the potential. Afterburner Complete is a fantastic version of that game and remains so today. Had all of these games been treated the same, we may have had 32X versions that were truly worthy of the 32-bit label. In part 2, we will be looking at even more games that were released on the two platforms. We'll look at a few wrestling games, a fighter, and even take a polygonal trip down memory lane. Did things improve any in the next batch? Tune in soon and find out. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.